The following podcast is for informational purposes only. The contents of this podcast do not constitute tax, legal, or investment advice. Take responsibility for your own decisions, consult with the proper professionals, and do your own research.
I basically make the argument in the blog post that is basically unnecessary and probably backwards in crypto, and that you're ultimately probably better off spending your energy in those beginning days selling your token.
GRTiQ podcast.
We are like astronauts floating in a space of time. Just between past and future.
Welcome to the GRTiQ podcast. Today I'm speaking with Mark Beylin, an associate at Boost VC, an early stage venture capital firm with expertise in deep tech hardware and software. And as you will hear, Mark is no stranger to the world of Web3 and blockchain. His journey includes founding roles and launching interesting tech, along with some amazing roles at Deloitte and ConsenSys. Recently, Mark has gained significant attention for some thought-provoking blogs, including one titled "The Token is the Product" and another, "The Hard Crypto Thesis," which have challenged conventional views and started industry-wide discussions. During this interview, we'll explore both of these blogs and the arguments Mark makes, and along the way, we'll also unpack some of Mark's professional experiences, his journey into Web3, some of his entrepreneurial insights, his take on the evolving crypto and tech industries, and the principles guiding his work at Boost VC. I started the conversation with Mark by asking about his early years growing up the child of Russian immigrants in Canada and how this background shaped his views on life and career.
Thanks so much for having me. I am originally from Toronto, Canada. My parents are originally from Russia, and I guess it was the Soviet Union, and, immigrated to Canada right before I was born. And so I'm very much a Canadian, but, my background's very much informed by Eastern European kind of origins, and growing up, a lot of my interests were very sort of skewed in that direction, classical music and different types of arts and things like that. And I had a very multi-dimensional youth, and I was really into, sports and different types of arts and various extracurriculars throughout high school. It was very kind of like multifaceted. I don't know how much more I could describe than that. But Toronto's a really amazing place to grow up. There's just like such an amazing, vibrant art scene and just like historically different things going on. So it was a really nice mix. Certainly, I feel very appreciative having growing up here.
I've had a lot of guests on the podcast, and longtime listeners know this, where they're the children of immigrants. And I'm always curious to sort of ask a follow-up question. Now, as you mentioned, you grew up in Canada, so it's not necessarily some of the other stories we've heard about parents immigrating to the United States, but still, what was it like for you, and how did it shape your approach to career and life being the son of immigrants, and some of the responsibilities, I guess, or pressures that might come with that?
I feel really grateful in hindsight. I think, when I was growing up, especially when I was in school, like public school, with classmates whose parents were sort of like native Canadians, my parents just seemed to always force me to do a lot more than theirs did. And they seemed to have a lot more sort of pressure and energy going into my life than, their lives seemed a little bit more lax. And at the time I was really, I almost want to say resentful of my parents and certainly not too happy about it. But obviously in hindsight, I feel really grateful for, all the pressure that they put on me, growing up, and, all the, again, extracurricular activities they supported, and also just extra kind of classes, math classes, French, all that kind of stuff. But which again, at the time I thought was, pure evil, but in hindsight was, super helpful in making it through college level calc classes and stuff like that.
Well, let's talk about university. So you went on to study computer science at the University of Waterloo, and you did some work in business administration as well as at Wilfrid Laurier. And you'll have to correct me if I'm saying that wrong, because I am a stupid American when it comes to pronunciation. But talk to us about your university, what you studied, and sort of how you came to the decision to study those fields.
So yeah, I do have to correct you. It's Wilfrid Laurier University. Wilfrid Laurier was actually one of our prime ministers in Canada. But so Wilfrid Laurier is a university that's just down the street from Waterloo. Waterloo being much more well-known in the States in particular for the various sort of engineering and computer science programs that they offer. But Laurier sort of is a much more kind of like liberal arts type focused school. And in particular, much more focused on their business program, which is kind of their premier offering. So several years ago, they joined forces, the University of Waterloo and Laurier. And instead of offering kind of individual bachelor programs in each of these directions, they came up with a dual degree program where students would take 5 years instead of 4 years and would walk away with like 2 bachelor's degrees. So they had a program for math and business and computer science and business. In my year, they accepted like 90 of us for my year. And I think like something in like the range of like 25 to 30 of us ended up actually graduating after 5 years. Most students end up dropping into either degree just because it's like on its own, computer science at Waterloo is like an extraordinarily challenging course load and just, yeah, it's like a fire hose of information. And so doing the business degree on top of that is really challenging for most folks. So doing both was a lot of fun. I made that decision largely just because I was really interested in startups in high school, watching movies like The Social Network, getting really just kind of bit by the startup bug and kind of realizing I would eventually want to build a technology company and that I would probably benefit from learning both how to build the technology side and also the company side. Yeah, so that ended up kind of informing that decision. And I kind of started getting my hands dirty in the startup side before I even graduated. But I'm certainly really grateful to both schools and I learned a ton. And there's a lot of people these days who are very bearish on post-secondary education, but I still think that if you do it right, if you go to a great school, and if you study right, you can learn a lot and it can be incredibly valuable.
What do you think sort of compelled that early interest in startup land? You sort of fashioned a university degree and I guess informed the decisions you'd make related to career based on some early interest in startups. What was it that drew your interest?
I always had kind of an interest in starting new things. I had done that kind of even in high school and through various sort of efforts over the years. So I always kind of enjoy starting new projects. It doesn't scare me and bringing things through to creation that didn't exist before has always been kind of exciting to me. When I was like in high school, that was like in the 2010s, there was obviously this like massive wealth creation event happening right on the internet and witnessing that and knowing that I'd already sort of realized I wanted to be an engineer. But I think to me, I also realized I had this kind of creative side as well. And like living through this like incredible wealth creation moment that I was, obviously really lucky for, that there was an opportunity to enter the sort of entrepreneurship stream and pursue that. And to be very blunt, just to be able to do well for myself and family and things like that.
During your studies in computer science, did you come across any sort of early Web3 blockchain distributed systems type of learnings that shaped a little bit of how you might approach something like Web3 and blockchain?
So it's actually really funny. It's how I got into crypto, actually. It's not actually technically through my computer science degree. I was at a hackathon. So I'd been really interested in the hackathon scene that was kind of popping up through the university space in the 2010s as well. And that also coincided with when I was going through college, which was, again, I felt really lucky for. I'm not sure that, the hackathon space is quite what it was at that time. But, going through that, I got really interested in Apple had just released this framework. I don't even remember what it was called, but it's the same actually framework that powers AirPlay and, AirDrop between your phones, which is like a Bluetooth plus Wi-Fi connection between devices. Apple had just released a framework. There was an app called FireChat that had been built on top of that. And so I was really interested in sort of applying that peer-to-peer framework tech with your phone and, building different types of apps that could live on top of that kind of network. And so I built an app at a hackathon that actually allowed you to check in as safe during natural disasters. If you remember, the way that you could on like Facebook, but imagining if you didn't have a Facebook connection, the internet or your cell service, you could download this app. If everyone had it, you would all sort of share these check-ins with each other. And then whoever initially gets internet connection would be able to upload it. So I actually just built that at a hackathon and got really into it. And that helped me get an internship in a crypto like group at Deloitte. And I didn't know anything about crypto at the time. I just knew a lot about distributed systems and was really interested in that space, wanted to go deep there. I don't want to say they bait and switched me, but they kind of were like, oh, this is distributed systems. And then I came in and they're like, actually, this is blockchain. That was actually how I fell down the rabbit hole. And obviously over the years have continued to be really interested in that side of crypto beyond just like the sort of tokens and economic stuff, but didn't end up continuing to build much at the node layer or, at relayer layer.
The GRTiQ podcast is made possible by a generous grant from the Graph Foundation. The Graph Grants program provides support for protocol infrastructure, tooling, dApps, subgraphs, and community building efforts. Learn more at thegraph.foundation. That's thegraph.foundation.
Hi, this is GRTiQ, and thank you for listening. Listeners who enjoy this content can help support the GRTiQ podcast by leaving a review or a 5-star rating wherever they download podcasts, by sharing episodes on social media, or by simply telling a friend or colleague about something they heard or learned from one of our guests. It's support from listeners like you that make it possible for us to keep shining a light on the people and stories behind Web3 and the graph.
Roger that.
Let's talk a little bit about then the work you did at Deloitte. So if there was a little bit of a bait and hook there, a little bit with the distributed systems to get you involved, but you fell down the rabbit hole, take us back in time. What drew your interest in the rabbit hole in the first place? And what did you see or recognize at that time that started you off in this direction?
I mean, if you can imagine, it was like January of 2016. I was like an intern. I was like a kid at the time. Deloitte had this group for exploring blockchains, cryptocurrencies, and in sort of developing that practice internally and that excellence internally within their Toronto office, sort of as part of a global effort. They kind of threw me in where basically, the first day they're like, okay, read the Bitcoin white paper top to bottom until you can understand it and Google anything you don't understand. And then move on to the, the yellow paper, the Ethereum yellow, and which nobody reads and like really is it's a different kind of document. It reads very differently. It doesn't serve the same kind of, function that the Bitcoin white paper does in terms of being able to sort of explain the protocol to a layman. It's a much more rigorous computer science white paper based on some decisions they made. But imagine, me just being thrown in there. I was like, okay, great. This is this new protocol. So it was the early days of Ethereum. Everything was still happening through things like Mist. We were doing a lot of like forking and of things that were open source and putting them together. So I remember at one point I was working on some like Frankenstein thing that was like Remix. It was like a bunch of tabs. It was like Remix. It was a block explorer. It was like you could send transactions and interact with like smart contracts. It was kind of like everything you could ever need to interact with a blockchain in one place, because none of these things existed at separate websites. None of these things like worked. We kind of wanted like our own. So anyways, that was like some of the first stuff that I was building there. And yeah, just like fell down that crypto rabbit hole that way. Eventually kind of had realized that, crypto was really interesting. Ethereum was really interesting. Watched sort of the DAO hack happen that summer. And I had a summer I'd done the internship at the beginning of the year, had kind of continued to engage in the Ethereum space a little bit over the summer. And then in the fall, I ended up actually going and doing internship at ConsenSys at their Toronto office. And so that really kind of solidified my entry into the crypto space. Whereas, in those Deloitte days, I was kind of still dipping my toes in. It was kind of that second job that really solidified things for me.
So Mark, how would you explain to somebody who looks at a guy like you and says, he's got a great education, he's got some background in business, got some background in computer science, he's got an interest in startups, entrepreneurship, he probably could go work anywhere. And yet here he is going sort of all in on this Web3 emerging industry. How would you explain to somebody why that happened or where that sort of drive came from?
I'm not too embarrassed to say that, I did try to apply to like the big FANG companies and, they just like didn't accept me. Whether that was like just because I didn't quite fit the mold that they were looking for, or just like didn't quite fit. But, I definitely tried and eventually kind of realized that it really wasn't for me. I wasn't really going to be a good fit. And even kind of working with some sort of more Web2 startups, I also quickly realized that it was not just quite as interesting for me, especially as the feeling I kind of felt when I entered sort of the Web3 space and started talking to folks in crypto who were just like very weird and were this like very particular type of weird. And so that was a feeling that I had never really experienced before in the other tech spaces. And just kind of that kind of countercultural ethos was really exciting to me and kind of, speaks to my interest a little bit. But the other element of this I do want to underscore is that like, okay, going back to like 2016, I was at Deloitte. Once I had figured out how the blockchain worked, right? This was this era where like nobody understood how blockchain, it was this like giant mystery in the market, right? And even very smart people didn't know how blockchain. As quickly, 3 weeks into my job at Deloitte, I was an intern and they just started pawning me off and I was explaining how blockchains work, but nobody really understood it. And so even in 2016, I had figured out like, okay, there is this like thing called a market arbitrage. I don't really know what that is, but I know that I know this thing that nobody else knows and that's really valuable. By sort of tail end of 2016, 2017, it had become clear that like Ethereum was really interesting and was really under appreciated and undervalued. That there were a lot of folks in the Bitcoin space that were, for a number of reasons, sort of refusing to look at it. Like if you could understand Bitcoin, there were a lot of people refusing. And for anyone who couldn't understand Bitcoin, good luck understanding smart contracts. And so I just sort of noticed there was this massive discrepancy between kind of like what I knew was true and what everyone else was seeing. And so I have to also be honest that like part of my interest was just, being able to be a part of that and help sort of, take advantage of this opportunity. Again, just kind of being in the right place. It felt a lot like just being at the right place at the right time, even though maybe from the outside, it might not have looked that way.
And so if you're in the right place at the right time and you're understanding things at this point that a lot of people around you simply don't understand, how are you viewing it? Are you viewing it as the emergence of new technology? Are you viewing it as the emergence of like new monetary or economic mechanisms or something else? I mean, take us in your mind at the time. What are you seeing?
All of the above. And I think it was also an era of a lot of people really kind of dreaming about what protocols could be, smart contract protocols could be, right? Now, folks like Jacob Horn talk about like hyperstructures, right? And they talk about smart contracts in this very dreamy way, but that actually is a reflection of the way that initially everybody talked about smart contracts, which was like every smart contract protocol was this like gleaming city on a hill. They were all this like perfect, beautiful, utopian thing. And so there was a lot of that energy and ethos running through a lot of the kind of conversations about protocol design or about applications that would be built on Ethereum. It was a lot of like the ideal version of a system that could eventually exist and could now exist. Again, like now, several years later, now much more jaded, I think there's things that we've learned that are like things that could be built in like a utopian sense, especially in terms of like free markets and really efficient markets, but that like shouldn't exist or won't exist because of various kind of like specific contextual market conditions, despite the fact that we can dream them up and even build them now. So I think that's kind of the biggest difference. Is like there was a ton of that kind of like utopian positive mindset at the time, versus now I think, folks are, a little bit more jaded and aware of the pitfalls.
Well, we're going to turn our attention here in a moment to talking about your work at Boost VC and a couple articles that you've written that have gained a lot of attention. I like to say like one of them has sort of a cult following and a lot of people interested in the ideas shared. Before we do that, though, I do want to ask you just quickly about your time at ConsenSys. You were working on Ethereum and doing work sort of related to the Ethereum ecosystem. My question is, if you're at Deloitte and you sort of get introduced to Bitcoin and blockchain, and you contrast that with your work at ConsenSys and doing work on Ethereum, how would you explain the different ahas you had with relationship to working and exploring Bitcoin and then getting exposure and working on something like Ethereum?
I had been introduced to the Ethereum ecosystem. And in fact, like most of the work that we did at Deloitte was still very Ethereum focused, but it was not quite the same in that it was much more at the time. I think it felt like much more we were outside the club trying to like take notes about what was happening inside the club and inside the party, right? We're kind of like peeking over the fences, trying to kind of like understand, but we weren't like really in the spaces. And I think the biggest difference for me, especially in like 2016 and 2017 at ConsenSys, in particular, they had like a Slack where, obviously folks who were working at ConsenSys were there, but even just people in the Ethereum community would hang out there. And so it felt like that was the actual sort of like center of the Ethereum ecosystem. It wasn't like all of the Ethereum ecosystem. There was tons of, really smart people working at that time who weren't affiliated with that project. But, nonetheless, like it felt that way, certainly to me, that like I had entered the sort of like middle of the pile or the orbit. I always think about communities as like an orbit and different people in the center versus on the edges. And yeah, ConsenSys certainly at the time felt like much more in the center. Deloitte was, a satellite on the edges.
So let's talk about the backstory of how you went from working at ConsenSys and landing at Boost VC. I'm understanding it's a little bit of a windy road. You did some stops along the way, but what can you tell us about that move?
Yeah. So, I had been an intern at ConsenSys. I'd gone back to school and started my first project, which was called the Bounties Network. We were like a freelancing marketplace on Ethereum. We powered a bunch of different marketplaces, including very famously Gitcoin. We grew that to like 1 million TVL. We eventually kind of sunsetted the project and put it on hold in terms of, developing the smart contract protocol. We've kind of gotten to a point where everything had kind of reached its maturity there. And we wanted to kind of hand the baton over to Gitcoin to kind of continue sprinting specifically on code bounties. But we really didn't see a lot of market potential and value in bounties at the time. Obviously, bounties have grown since then and become this like massive space kind of in two directions. One of which is like around airdrop farming, which, was just like not a business I would have been particularly or was particularly interested in building. And then you kind of get to the other side, which is more around the freelancing, which has continued to struggle. And so that was kind of the first thing we did. It was very interesting and people have continued to try, and every like kind of 6 months, somebody knocks on my door and says like, hey, Mark, I'm thinking of starting a freelancing marketplace. Can you tell me everything you've learned? Which is always great. And I'm always happy to take those calls. But that was a really fun, interesting first thing to have done. And yeah, after that, built a number of different other projects, something called Myco, which was like a DAO community platform really focused on profit sharing rather than kind of like tokens. And I was really interested in that idea of like not having a token which was tradable on a free market, but instead kind of taking the opposite approach from a regulatory perspective, which was having it not be traded, but only earned. And then in doing so, have it be useful for profit sharing and rev sharing. So we did that for a couple of years. Eventually, we spun down that project, couldn't make that work. Have built a number of other projects over the years as well, some NFT projects, different things. And so, yeah, over the years, as you could kind of hear me talking about it, you could tell I've had a lot of different permutations of like success and failure. And crypto's weird like that, where, you can do things that work, but don't make money. You could do things that like don't work and make money. You can do things that don't work and don't make money, and things that work and make money. And ideally, you're doing like that last one, but very often you end up doing the other three too. And so I've certainly been, I guess, lucky enough to have experienced kind of all of the above. And yeah, it's definitely been very interesting. Crypto is really complicated, specifically for product builders in that way. But that's informed a lot of my work at this point and getting to this point where now on the investing side, I was really lucky to be introduced to the folks at Boost a couple of years ago. And eventually, after spinning down my last company, decided that they had a role that, was a really great fit for me. And joined the team there about a year ago.
I always like to ask this question to somebody with your background on the podcast about entrepreneurship. So you've done some startups, you've tried your hand at some things. You just mentioned there that, crypto's a unique environment to be this way. Now you're working at Boost VC, and I imagine a lot of your role is identifying good ideas and allocating investment opportunity there. My question is, given all that experience, like, what do you think makes a successful entrepreneur? What are the qualities, the 2 or 3 things that if a listener is listening to this interview and wants to be an entrepreneur, that they should sort of target or optimize? Do you have any theory or ideas around that?
The first thing that I'll say is like a really great entrepreneur lives in truth. And what I mean by that is really, really militantly committed to figuring out what is actually true and like really hates lying to themselves. And I think that's like a really important quality to have, in particular in those early days, looking for product market fit, trying to validate your assumptions, test your hypotheses. You want to actually be really committed to figuring that out in a way that's almost like scientific. And you need to have that like constant commitment to like, what is actually true around me and how can I readjust based on that? Because I think that's like constantly required of a leader, of a founder, and of an entrepreneur. I think grit is another big one that's really needed, is just like being able to make it through really tough times and just like survive. And then I think the final one is like the quality of a winner and the reality that like nobody succeeds. And this is especially over the years. And now sitting on the side in venture, I see this even more. Like nobody succeeds accidentally. The people who win very intentionally because they want to win and because they're like hunting the buck. And, business is a hunt in that way. And you are ultimately competing for territory with other people in the market. If whatever you're doing is in any way valuable, or if you discover something that ends up being valuable, you will eventually have. So having not just like grit, which is like, I think the ability to sort of withstand pain or difficult times, but also like the desire to win, this desire to say like, I want to be the best. I want to, do the best thing to deliver the best work or product or whatever service it is. I think you have to have that like winning mindset. And I almost think of like Olympians in that regard, where like the best founders are Olympians in whatever field they are in. They're like exceptional humans. They work really hard. They take really good care of themselves in the way that Olympians do. They're like really serious humans. And when you meet really impressive entrepreneurs, you kind of miss that.
So I now want to turn our attention to some of the things you've written, and we'll talk about your role at Boost VC and relationship to these things in a moment. But one of the articles that you've written, it's a blog titled "The Token is the Product." It was published in March 2024. And as I've said to you, I've asked other guests on the podcast about that thesis, and I'm always surprised that people have read it and know about it. So as I said, it's got a little bit of a cult following there. And then the other one that you recently published in August 2024 called the Hard Crypto Thesis. I want to start with the blog called The Token is the Product. For any listeners that haven't taken the time to kind of click into the link or go read that blog post, do you mind just telling us what the core argument you were making there in that blog and, the central thesis?
I made a somewhat controversial take. That was meant to be the intention of the blog post. It was meant to be a sort of wake-up call, especially for founders who had been approaching entrepreneurship in a way, really, quite frankly, that I had over many years, which was disregarding a lot of the speculative behavior and token-related activities and focusing on kind of just building a great product or building a great community or doing all these things that like traditional startup building tells us are valuable activities, right? Or the right thing to do at the beginning of building your company. And I basically make the argument in the blog post that that is basically unnecessary and probably backwards in crypto, and that you're ultimately probably better off spending your energy in those beginning days selling your token and then focusing on taking the energy that is accumulated via selling your token and then using that to sell your product and build your product and deliver it sometimes. And that's a very complicated thing. Obviously, for legal regulatory reasons, it's very, very complicated, right? Because, this isn't like a trivial thing for entrepreneurs. There's, an ideal way an entrepreneur might want to do that based in the US, but there's a way that they have to. And those are two very misaligned directions. But nonetheless, like the evidence, I kind of point to a number of, pieces of evidence and moments in time where we can look back and say, you know what, this is actually how this has played out. The evidence speaks for itself. The token evidently is the product in enough of these cases where you don't need another product, right? And people have succeeded. The best products have not succeeded and the best tokens have won. And so I'm not as prescriptive about what makes a great token or how to sell a great token. I think those are like independent blog posts. I think that like remains to be seen. But I think if there's one thing I can commit to, right, and write in a way that I really kind of want to emphasize for anyone who knows me or who I've worked with or who I might be able to help on their journeys, right? I wanted to kind of wake them up and say, hey, you're probably underappreciating this activity and it's actually way more important to your business than you've probably realized. But that's kind of like my high level description. My advice is like, if any of that's interesting, just read the whole thing. I spent a lot of time rewriting that blog post. So it's like, it's been very refined and it's like much more refined than certainly this verbal description of it was.
Sure. And I'll put a link in the show notes for anybody who wants to. And I'll reference maybe some of the prior podcast guests I've had on where I've sort of posed this question of, is it actually true that the token is the product? One of the examples that you bring up in your blog is the Helium network. And so is that then sort of the gold standard for a project that you think got this relationship right between product and token?
Yeah, I think Helium is a really, really prime example. And there was a moment in time, and I remember it because I actually was like, again, a participant in the Helium network. I was sort of, again, I felt lucky to be there in that moment where I was like, wait a minute, this thing is actually going online right now. And I know how to run this thing. Let me try to do it. But I think it was like around 2020, they were going live with their network and they had already launched their token, right? They'd already sold their token. They'd already had this massive plan to take on really what are like in these, glorified incumbents, it's like an oligopoly, these telecom companies, and they get to continue to persist in this way because there's this massive capital requirement to take them on to compete. So nobody does. And so there's basically no way to compete with these telecom companies to provide alternative services. These guys at Helium said, wait a minute, actually, if we can gather enough interest and energy around this token and get people to all realize that we can all coordinate around this sort of unified economic system that we create ourselves, that could be its own independent, valuable system that, we don't need to ask for permission from these large telecom companies to use their towers. We can build our own towers. And so what they did is they actually allowed people to buy these like miners, these little rack miners that were like essentially like little internet nodes, and they talked to each other and could challenge each other and could do all this stuff to keep the network alive. But also in doing so were the setup for what would eventually become the Helium network. And he was like, I don't actually think, again, I don't have the best information on this. I'm not as well researched on Helium's early days as I'd perhaps even like to be. So I don't know specifically how many users were actually on the network compared to the token rewards and like what that balance was like. But I certainly know that that miners were being rewarded for running those nodes and participating in the network regardless of the traffic that they were receiving. And so, and I think in that regard, it's important to sort of recognize that like the economic system was being bootstrapped despite the fact that the demand side of this marketplace hadn't been sort of brought into the market yet, right? There were not really like that many users who were actually like buying, so to speak, broadband from the Helium network, but they had a ton of people who were sort of selling by running these nodes. And in particular, they were subsidizing that using their token. That example, that sort of playbook is going to, I assume, end up being a very similar playbook, at least at a high level, for disrupting a lot of very high capitally intensive businesses that otherwise, when you can distribute this cost of spinning that network up or taking on this incumbent, if you could split that among a large number of participants who can sort of bear their own burden, their own small sort of fraction of the cost, you can actually take on these very large incumbents. And so the key is like to do that, they had to sell people on this token and on this vision, right? You had to want to buy a rack biter so you could earn their token, which means upstream of that, you had to believe in their token. You had to believe in this vision. You had to believe in all of them. And they executed, I think, really, really well. Now the network is live. You can now buy a plan through Helium and I think from what I hear, get pretty great service. And that's really exciting and starts to become a backbone for like a new kind of internet and a new sort of class of applications that can live on Helium instead of having to, live on some of the other kinds of internet networks that users might be accustomed to. I know that's like protocols like Debo are starting to do that where, they're using and they offer an alternative on Helium versus kind of existing cell networks.
Is part of the nuance, and maybe it's not as nuanced as I'm making it sound, of your argument that life cycle sort of matters here, that the early days of the project, it really needs to kind of get that vision or buy-in on the token, but over time, as things mature, there needs to be a shift or a gravitation away from that and more towards the actual tech or product? Or do you maintain that sort of equilibrium exists from, early days through the maturity of the project? How do you think about that?
The short answer is like, it totally depends on how forgiving your specific market is, right? And I think that just depends on whoever the project is. They might attract market participants that are particularly forgiving, who will be willing to hold their token despite, many, many long years of like inactivity, right? And so versus you might be sort of required to ship on a more regular basis. I think Elon Musk is actually a really prime example of this, where he is constantly with his work. You see the way that he sort of presents his work. He's like constantly shipping on a regular cadence, and the shipping he does actually helps him sell more of his token, which is like Tesla shares or SpaceX shares or, the debt that they issue. And so by constantly like shipping product and selling future vision at the same time, he is able to then fund that future vision. And so it's like actually like a sort of self-reinforcing cycle. I think there's very few people who can go for long periods of time without fulfilling a feedback loop and sort of like delivering to the market what you promised, or at least a version of it. And so I think in that regard, like there is a feedback loop that happens with really amazing projects over many years. I think Ethereum is a great example where despite many bear cycles and downturns and hacks and all these different awful things that have happened, it's continued to bounce back. The community has a lot of resiliency. And so that's, I think, like a great example there too.
How has your view of this topic, or the position that you sort of articulated in March of this year, evolved since you published it? As I said, a lot of people read it, a lot of people reference this, and it is a slight paradigm shift to traditional models, let alone the way I think some projects are approaching this question of token value versus the product or service value. Has your view on the topic evolved since then?
Not particularly. I think that now that there are a lot of people thinking in this way, which I'm really delighted about, like I think it's better for the whole market to live in recognition of this fact that this is like a good thing. But downstream of that, sort of like the next subsequent question is like, well, what's the right way to sell a token? I think that's been kind of maybe the question of the year. There was a lot of people writing a lot of really interesting threads earlier in the year, in particular about like token launches and high FTV launches or, low FTV launches and, these different alternatives. There's, I think, like many open questions, but I think we're all sort of like aligned that they need to be asked and that exploration needs to be done. The market is still obviously tricky. And so people are timid about doing token launches, in particular before the election. Hopefully after the election with more clarity, there can be a clear path towards more exploration of different types of models. But I think it's just going to take like some more time. And this is maybe a segue into the other article is like, I actually think the people who need that article the most are not yet even in crypto. And so I don't know what it will read like in a year, but my hope is that in a year, I can still send it to folks in my network who are still getting into crypto and who still haven't realized this sort of like universal truth that I do think is like a kind of universal crypto truth. And I think is part of the way that crypto is going to disrupt all business models, even outside of businesses that touch crypto specifically or use smart contracts specifically, that tokens are they just change business models in a way that everyone's going to have to pay attention.
I do want to turn our attention to the hard crypto thesis. Before I do want to give sort of the devil's advocate who might be listening or who has read the article and is interested in hearing maybe a question like this. But how do you respond to maybe criticism of the position you took in that blog post, the token is a product, for people that say you're just making a very academic sort of high-minded argument in favor of hype and hype around just tokens? Do you have a response for something or a criticism like that?
I think that criticism is generally speaking true. I made an argument that is hopefully an intellectual argument about why like hype has worked, right? And I think like the problem is that there are so many of us who are really focused on using our logical brains, and like that information has not made its way into our brains. We've like filtered it out in every other capacity. Certainly over many years, I managed to filter out this fact that many other people in the crypto space already had figured out, which is the tokens. But I had lived in ignorance for years. And I'd hoped that by writing in this, like, I don't want to say high-minded, but, you know, like in a way that was like I was trying to be very evidence-driven. I was trying to be like very specific and highlight like very tangible examples of like why the hype works and like what is the dynamic at play here, looking at it through maybe a scientific lens. And so, you know, that was definitely my intention. I think it's definitely hype, right? That's like a maybe great way to think about it. But I do think that ultimately the best tokenized systems are not just hype. Again, you know, Elon Musk, like you can look at the work that Elon Musk does and the way that he raises capital for himself as like, oh, he's just a hype man. Like, sure, but he's also really talented at having his product cycles driven in a way that they actually reinforce his capital structure and his ability to raise capital is really interesting and like actually not that common. Most people do product development driven by customers. They don't really think quite as much about product development driven by the people who are actually funding this. But the reality is, like in crypto, sometimes all those three people are the same person. Your customer is your investor, is your user, and might also maybe run a node in some other context. And so like things get so blurry in the crypto space that I think everyone needs to kind of pay attention. Like I said, my goal was to kind of like shake people and wake them up and wake them up to the value of hype, you know, and to emphasize in the article that like just doing that alone is obviously still scamming, right? And like just selling people tokens and never delivering anything. I mean, good luck doing it for very long, but like, that's like not what we're talking about, right? And we're not talking about building like a successful tokenized system in that way. You're just talking about, that's like a different kind of activity. And my hope is that, you know, anyone reading the article sort of understood that that was not my intention or really what I was trying to do.
Agreed. And I also think that point is very clearly articulated in the blog. And as I said, I'll put a link in the show notes for anyone that wants to read or reread that. Let's now talk about what you recently published in August 2024. It's called The Hard Crypto Thesis, another very interesting blog that really relates, I think, to your work at Boost VC and articulates some of the investment thesis there. But if you don't mind, can you also just take us through sort of the core argument you're making in this blog post and some of the thinking behind it?
Totally. Yeah. And, you know, this one is a very different kind of blog post. I think this one's much more hypothetical and much more kind of future focused. But it really kind of, you're right, is based on the, you know, the position that I'm in right now at Boost and the kind of experience that I've had over the years in crypto, having worked in these projects that have tried to build for real world systems. That was like some of the first tech that I did at ConsenSys or, you know, at Deloitte. There were all these proof of concepts, right? There were these POCs, but they were all trying to eventually build towards this goal of like, how do we build systems for like supply chain tracking or, you know, all these different like tangible real world systems on crypto, you know, on crypto systems, on crypto rails. So that's been a really old problem I've been interested in for a while. And yeah, over this kind of year, based on my position at Boost, I've been able to witness kind of a number of things. One, we have this like massive explosion happening in the hard tech fields, in particular in biotech and in robotics. In biotech, driven by sort of decreasing costs around genomics and like lab sequencing and just like in general skyrocketing design space compared to like costs. And then again, looking at like the hardware space, robotics, we see like falling costs of, off the shelf hardware, making it really easy, open source robotics, make it just generally speaking, way easier than ever before for people to, 3D printing, making it easy for anybody to build whatever they want. So there's just basically these like massive design spaces opening up in like hardware, in biotech right now, right? And then simultaneously, we see that like crypto is ready for a more mainstream audience, ready for a more sort of like non-crypto native use cases, right? We can start to point to use cases like Helium and examples like Helium. And this is, I think, one of the poignant statements I make in the blog post is like, look, any reasonable high IQ individual up until the year 2024 could have made an argument that like blockchains are a scam, tokens are all a scam, and that would have been like a reasonably defensible argument for them to make. I imagine at like a party in San Francisco. And my claim is that like in the year 2024, that's like no longer a defensible position. There is simply too much evidence on the contrary that tokens not only are they like useful for allocating capital, but that allocation of capital and that sort of concentration of value can be used to achieve very real goals in the real world outside of crypto systems, outside of, DeFi or rehypothecation or any of that. And so I think like, examples like that are paving the way for really, I think, a new generation of crypto companies to be born. I kind of point to it as like, right now we have like DeSci, we have RWAs, and we have DeepHID. I don't really like any of those three spaces specifically. There's like, each of them are focused on this kind of very overarching problem in their own ways. But I think ultimately crypto is like such a valuable tool for capital formation that it's inevitable to be that crypto business models are going to kind of continue to invade hard tech spaces. And I think practically speaking, what that means is we're going to see more and more hard tech founders pivoting into crypto. And I know there was like a huge movement, sort of several years ago of like, oh, if your business isn't working, pivot into crypto, Long Island crypto, whatever, Long Island blockchain. And I think the reality is like, we actually are going to see people whose business models are not able to be sustained by traditional venture funding or traditional paths, in particular based on, the long time it takes to, get your drug through different trials and through the FDA, whatever. Based on that business model, it simply is not working. The math isn't mathing. And so if there is alternatives in the crypto space that can offer, funding for these kinds of projects, yeah, smart people are going to look for funding elsewhere. And so just increasingly over the next couple of years, especially with funding environments kind of being very dynamic, we're going to see more people building tokenized and network-oriented versions of businesses that might otherwise have been revenue-based. And I think that's also really interesting and really exciting. But yeah, that's kind of the ultimate thesis there. It's just that we live in this really interesting time. I think this is about to play out over the next couple of years. I don't think it's going to happen overnight, but I think it's already starting. And just, for me being based in SF now and talking to a lot of hard tech founders, I love to pick their brains about this and kind of, almost troll them about it because I know they're all, super allergic to crypto. And I have to say that like more than ever before, once you start to talk through like kind of token models with them, they start to realize very quickly the value there. So I think it's coming, but I think it'll just take a couple of years.
A follow-up to all of that is, again, I won't summarize the blog as well as you can, but I'm reading it and seeing it sort of like as an argument in favor of why the time is now to start exploring this thesis. And you do a good job, obviously, defining hard crypto and talking about the sort of sectors and technology that this is at play. You talk about these token business models, but another thing you talk about is this trustless coordination at scale. Can you double click on why something like that coordination sort of enabled through token business models is novel and could do something new or fresh to these existing models?
I don't even think of it like business model. I think of it like economic model, right? Because what we're talking about is like, and in fact, most businesses in the world have entire economies built around them, right? Salesforce is a great example where, Salesforce is Salesforce. And then there's a bunch of tiny small fish swimming alongside Salesforce, building their businesses in the sort of ecosystem around it. So that's like a pretty common thing that already happens. And so I think getting to this world where instead of these kind of companies building like a business model, but instead thinking of building this like economic model around themselves, around their token, I think that is where, basically the thesis is like things are moving in the direction of these kind of broader economic models that basically allow for large numbers of participants to intermediate with each other, right? Going back to the Helium example, whereas before, broadband, like, internet broadband is like a two-sided marketplace connection between me, the purchaser, and the, my internet provider, the seller. Now, all of these like many different small, tiny participants can come together, and together they sort of like it's like the Ant-Man. They sort of like form this massive thing. And that is the service provider that I interact with. But it's actually made up of a giant number of small participants that we're all able to kind of like coordinate with each other via this protocol, that protocol being like the glue that helped them stick together. So that I think is the vision for what a lot of these protocols will look like, at least again, at a rough level. And, I don't think it will be a lot of these sort of DAOs administered in the way that we think about them right now. I think it will be, again, a lot more kind of trustless protocols where the marketplace and the token really is this kind of bridge between different groups of people and acts as this sort of like economic bucket for value flowing in and out of an ecosystem. Again, what that looks like is not totally clear yet, but I do think it's coming. And I think that trustless coordination powered by smart contracts is going to be kind of a key part of it.
In your role at Boost VC, you get exposure to a lot of really interesting opportunities. I read a little bit that you've been able to study and develop some understanding, maybe expertise on the intersection of crypto and AI. You're clearly making some great arguments in the Hard Crypto Thesis blog post. But if you don't mind just pulling back the curtain a little bit, what are some of the stories or use cases or investment opportunities that you're tracking that have you most excited, including AI?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, I love the non-crypto side of, the investments we get to make and companies, that we work with or founders in our network. We're investors in a company, for instance, called Radiant Nuclear. And context there is like they're building shipping containers that are also like nuclear reactors, basically the size of shipping containers. And they've been on this journey for like many, many years. They've still got many years to go. They're doing really, really well. That's kind of like one example where it's like very, very cutting edge tech, very long, development cycles. Nobody else is willing to invest. But when we see like an incredible founder and a model that makes sense, right? The energy model there makes a ton of sense. And more and more people are sort of waking up to this distributed energy world that we live in and the sort of necessity of creating energy at the source or excuse me, at the moment where it's in the location where it's actually being used. There's a number of benefits there. Radiant's obviously exploring that. So that's a kind of like one example of a company I'm very excited about. The canonical example that I tell people, when I joined, one of the first investments we made is into a company called Dognosis. And so, when I tell people what we do, I was like, we do crypto, AI, VR, bio, robotics, space, climate. Oh, and by the way, we also do cancer sniffing dogs. And so Dognosis, they work with dogs actually, which sniff human masks that have been breathed on and contain traces of various sort of pheromones and different things in their breath that the dogs can actually use to detect cancer early on at a much lower cost and a higher rate than would otherwise be available, certainly in India, which is one of the markets we're targeting. So that's like one example where I don't want to go too deep into how they're doing it. They're an incredible team. They're doing really great stuff. It's not crypto native, but it's just, a really awesome deep tech. So that's a lot of what it's like at Boost, where we just talk to, amazing founders building at the edges of the map. And then that does also get to include crypto too. And we're really lucky to be able to sort of connect all of these different types of founders to each other. And they oftentimes realize like, wait a minute, actually, there's a ton of overlap between us because it takes a certain type of person to build a deep tech company. That's kind of what we're looking for is that type of person. There's obviously a number of different types of archetypes and it doesn't always look the same. And we try not to pattern match too hard in that regard. But we do find there's like a lot of kind of cross-industry benefit there as well, just purely by osmosis.
Mark, a question I regularly ask on this podcast is related to mass adoption. I think in your blog post, The Hard Crypto Thesis, you sort of accepted some premises about the state of the industry now and that it's easier than ever before for people to kind of get involved and activated in crypto, to begin using blockchain and these types of things. But if we lean into this argument that we haven't quite reached mass adoption yet, are you watching or tracking any sort of specific mileposts or any sort of particular activity that sort of unlocks this great allure that we all talk about of gaining mass adoption?
Yeah, totally. I think Helium is a great example here where they achieved this level of crypto adoption of, spinning up their network because they had this broad network of users actually running the nodes. And so I think that's kind of a quality that we've forgotten about, especially with a lot of the tokens that have launched recently being, these like L1 or L2 networks where all the nodes validating the networks are like very centralized or, proof of stake, whenever they like aren't really quite as worried about onboarding nodes in the same way. But I think that kind of an approach is ultimately what a real crypto system looks like. That's like really the sort of the final goal that I think we need to like be chasing and really going after in terms of like, what does a real tokenized network look like? So practically speaking, for me, when I think about like mass adoption, that looks like the adoption of crypto systems throughout a variety of our sort of like live, interactions and our the use cases that we interact with various businesses around us. When there are kind of more node oriented projects, right? And I think we'll start to be able to track like how many of those different types of users are there, right? Who participate, whether it's, in the Hard Crypto Thesis, I gave a bunch of examples like, people sharing eggs, in their local communities and that, creating some kind of like local network around that. But if it's like a crypto network and there's like real life value being, interacted with or transacted or created, or whatever, that to me is like a check mark. That's like a win. And so, RWAs here are a little bit complicated because a lot of times you're just talking about trading a facsimile for something that's happening in the real world. You're not actually influencing the real world. And I think that's the element. You need to sort of like mutate the real world around you. Nodes kind of are my vague approximation for that. But that sort of mutation, that changing the world around you is the sort of gateway to actually, protocols that can make the world a better place, which, if your protocol doesn't have some goal towards in that regard, like you're probably not going to make it.
Mark, actually, I have one final follow-up with you before we get to the GRTiQ 10, actually. And I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you, but given the fact that you have this really great view of the industry, you're working at Boost VC, you're evaluating investment opportunities, and you're exploring and doing deep research on where the opportunities are. You've written these great blog posts that have, as I said, really developed a following and changed the way people are thinking about things. If you don't mind, I'd love to just kind of get your quick take on something like the graph. A lot of my listeners are extremely enthusiastic about the graph and Web3 data. As you look at the Web3 industry, do you have an opinion on something like the graph and how it fits into Web3 and the problem it aims to solve?
Totally. Yeah. I mean, again, I have to, confess my, disclaimer here is like my sister, Eva, is the director at the Graph Foundation. So I'm like slightly biased, but I'll try to answer in a truly unbiased way, which is that, I was around ConsenSys in those early days. Infura was being built and, before the variety of Infura competitors and graph competitors and all that stuff, before all those were launched. And even back then, we sort of all, I think, knew deep down that it probably made sense for some version of this to be decentralized, even though nobody really knew how to do that and what that would look like. And over the years, obviously, the graph was born. It's been so many years. It's been such a sort of like long process of like developing the product, launching everything, going live with the various, elements of it and kind of moving through the various phases. And I think if there's one quality that I love about the graph, it's like, I feel like the graph is like, in my head, one of the cockroach protocols of crypto, and in my head, we had Boost say like, be the cockroach in an endearing way as a compliment of like, we want to back founders who are cockroaches, who will survive kind of at all costs and who are unkillable. And I think there's a few crypto protocols where we see, the founders are still grinding, the team's still grinding, they're still in it. There's just like a lot of commitment to achieve that goal that they originally set out to do, right? They're really trying to kind of bring that vision forward and to spin up this like decentralized protocol. I think of the graph as kind of like one of those great cockroach protocols. There's a few others examples. LivePeer is another great example that comes to my mind of like, or Arweave, where like these guys are just cockroaches and they are just grinding. And even though you can't point to them and say like, the work is done, they've succeeded, it's still like an evolving, we're still sort of moving. I think the graph is still moving towards it and the ecosystem still sort of like watching and waiting to see how this all plays out. But nonetheless, like the graph ecosystem continues to remain very strong. And that's been awesome to see.
I'll put links in the show notes if you want to learn a little bit more about Eva's background. And of course, I interviewed Sam Williams, the founder over at Arweave. And I've had several Lifecycle members on, including Yondan, one of the founders over there. So definitely check out the show notes. As I said, Mark, I'm now going to ask you the GRTiQ 10. These are 10 questions I ask each week. I ask them because I want to inspire listeners to learn something new, try something different, or achieve more in their own life. And as I said, it allows us to get to know you a little bit more on the personal side. So Mark, are you ready for the GRTiQ 10?
I hope so, yeah.
The GRTiQ 10.
10 questions for astronauts floating in space.
What book or article has had the most impact on your life?
It's a book called Human Accomplishment by Charles Murray, which I love. I don't want to say it's necessarily my favorite book, but it had an immense impact on me. And it kind of studies human accomplishment and excellence over, I think it's like 2000 BC all the way to 1950 and across a number of different domains. But it's really interesting. And I was just particularly kind of interested in this idea of excellence as a concept. And what does it take for humans to be excellence? Why do these pockets of excellence come up? And it, I think, just like got me really excited about communities, community building, and what is really possible when you bring a lot of like really talented or really high caliber people in the same room or, beside each other.
And how about this, Mark? Is there a movie or a TV show that you would recommend everybody should watch?
I have a favorite movie, which is Cloud Atlas by the Wachowski siblings and the sisters. I don't know if everyone would make it through that movie or if it's necessarily for everyone, but I wish everyone could watch it and could love it. I think it's the best movie ever made. I think it's like one of the most interesting movies ever made and one of the best uses of like the craft in terms of expressing like a story using film. What they do with like kind of characters and actors is very interesting. I don't want to get into it or spoil it, but that's definitely the movie I would recommend. Very poetic, very beautiful, very, very kind of thought-provoking.
Mark, if you could only listen to one music album for the rest of your life, which one do you choose?
That would be, it's an album of Yo-Yo Ma plays Ennio Morricone. Ennio Morricone was like an Italian composer from the 20th century. And there's an album of Yo-Yo Ma playing some of his selected tracks that I really love. And I could spend the rest of my life listening to just that album and I'd be happy.
What's the best advice someone's ever given to you?
It's actually a piece of advice my father has told me my whole life, which is the difference between medicine and poison is dosage.
What's one thing you've learned in your life that you don't think most other people have learned or know quite yet?
I mean, is it a cop-out to say how the blockchain works?
Not at all. Not at all. And I believe
that's what I'm going to say that, yeah. And how smart contracts work, I guess.
What's the best life hack you've discovered for yourself?
Learning by doing, or like throwing myself in the deep end and learning to be really comfortable there. And in that experience, you can learn just like way faster if you are, okay at improv.
And then Mark, based on your own life experiences and observations, what's the one habit or characteristic that you think best explains how or why people find success in life?
I think it's probably the ability to learn. Learning is a key quality in life, and the most successful people. And I think actually I'm going to even double down and say like in our lifetimes, this will be more evidently true as our society becomes more meritocratic. And as we have like AI now, the separation between people who are interested in learning and like I kind of said at the beginning around entrepreneurs, like who want to live in truth, people who are really interested in that with an AI, with a large language model will learn, anything they want as quickly as they can. People who are not interested in learning will sort of wither on the vine. And so the ability to learn, the interest in learning, knowing how to learn quickly is incredibly important. Everybody learns differently, knowing your own kind of methods. But like learning to learn it is a skill. I think it is like a muscle. It's not, I don't think people are just like born with it, but I do think people are born with like a curiosity. And I do think people are born with like a desire to learn. I think most people just kind of wear it away and kind of it goes away. They get bored.
And then Mark, the final three questions of the GRTiQ 10 are complete the sentence type questions. So the first one is, the thing that most excites me about the future of Web3 is?
It is restaking.
And how about this one? If you're on X, I still call it Twitter, you should be following
Vitalik because he started tweeting again.
And finally, Mark, how about this one? I'm happiest when?
I am happiest, when I am grounded, I would say. That's probably the best way I would put it. What that looks like is always different, but yeah, grounded.
The GRTiQ 10.
And I show you how deep
Mark, thank you so much for taking the time to join the GRTiQ podcast. It was a lot of fun to explore not only your career and your backstory of how you got involved in the industry, but the blog posts you've written that have shaped a lot of people's thinking on some important topics. It was a lot of fun. If listeners want to follow you, stay in touch with the work that you're doing, maybe catch the next blog post, what's the best way for them to stay in touch?
Yeah, definitely on Twitter or X, as some people call it. That's definitely the best way to reach me. My DMs are open. I generally try to be pretty responsive, in particular to founders and entrepreneurs. If you're ever building anything or, need any help or feedback from someone who's been on kind of the investing side, as well as the founder side, folks should always feel free to reach out. And yeah, in general, I'm always around, always tweeting. Just don't take anything I say too seriously.
This has been a production of the GRTiQ podcast. For more information, including detailed show notes, visit grtiq.com/podcast. That's grtiq.com/podcast.
Please consider contributing to this project and helping build the community by subscribing and leaving a review.
GRTiQ
Podcast. Roger that.